Are you moving to Boise, Idaho and thinking about building or buying a new home? Let me help you make sense of it all in this step-by-step guide where we will navigate the journey together, and I think you'll find that it's a lot simpler than you might think. So in today's video, we're gonna explore how to buy or build a brand new home here in Idaho. And today to help us is gonna be Spencer, one of the real estate agents with the Living in Idaho team, as well as Gavin, a great lender that a lot of my clients partner with when they choose to buy a home here. In this video, we're gonna talk about whether you need a real estate agent to represent you, if that's a good idea or a bad idea. We'll talk about the different types of builders and the different types of homes that you can get. We'll talk about setting expectations, locations, designs. We'll also touch on negotiations. We'll talk about the different types of loans that you have available to you, and we'll talk about earnest money. Now, quickly, before we jump in, let me just paint a really simple roadmap of what the process of buying a new home or building a new home will be like here in Idaho. Number one is gonna be hiring a real estate agent, and we'll talk about why that's gonna be a good idea and doesn't cost you anything. And number two is gonna be finding your location or community. And then number three is gonna be picking the builder after you've done steps 1 and 2. Now, let's dive into this exciting journey of building or buying your new home here in Idaho. Now let's start out with a real estate agent. Should you hire one? And if you should, why? The main reason that you would want a realtor is that you would have an expert in your corner to go to bat for you. Additionally, they take off a huge workload if you pick the right one. And ultimately, you might be wondering, well, what does that even cost? And the answer to that is zero. And that's because the builder typically pays the realtor's commission in the closing costs as part of the sale. So then a question you might be thinking, well, what happens to that money if I, the buyer, just go straight to the builder? The answer is that the builder just keeps that money. But if you hire a realtor to help you through the process and to help you negotiate and to make sure that you get what you want and that you're represented, then the builder takes that money that they've already set aside to pay as a commission to the real estate agent. So in essence, you don't pay the realtor directly, the builder does. And having a realtor on your side can be very beneficial and no cost to you. Next, we're going to talk about the types of builders and the types of homes that you have available to you.
There's custom, there's semi-custom, and then there's production builders.
So to break that down real quick, a custom home is built to your specific preferences. You're in control of everything. And then a semi-custom home offers some customization within kind of a predefined layout. And a production home is a pre-built, possibly mass-produced home with very little customizational options.
With the production build, really what happens is you don't get to make any selections. The house is built the way it is. You know, sometimes in those communities, they're built at scale, so you can go walk through a lot of them, and that's really nice for a lot of people. They can actually see that property. If it fits a certain price point too, production's great because you have a really good idea of the home that you're going to be getting. Now, semi-custom is one of those where you have the ability to somewhat make some selection changes and some slight variations depending on the builder. And then you have the full custom. The full custom, it's kind of a double-edged sword.
So talk to anybody who has designed a fully custom home, and something they'll definitely tell you is that they probably had decision fatigue because you need to dream everything up and decide on everything before the project starts so that you can lock in the scope of work. Now that we've kind of looked at those options, there could be some deciding factors that really help you determine what's going to be best for you. And one of those could be timing. Do you have 6 to 12 months to sit around for a house to be finished, or do you need to move into something in the next 1 to 3 months?
With the semi-custom, they're ones that have some more flexibility because typically a build is about 6 to 7 months to a year, depending on the builder. And what's nice sometimes with semi-custom is I can come into a house and say, hey, can we make some selections? Can we change a paint color? Can we add a few things? And if it fits someone's time frame, hey, I need to be able to sell my house and get into this next house in the next 3 to 4 months. It's great because you get to pick your selections, you get to move into the house, your liabilities from the time you sell to move into that house is lessened, so your risk is less, but you can kind of get what you want.
Now let's talk about builders. There are tons of options here in the Valley, and there's some things that you probably should consider.
When you're thinking about the different builders in Idaho, there's a variety of different builders that come in, especially with our growth, and it's a small community here. Some of these builders come in that might not know how to build in certain areas. I mean, we have a variety of different places to build here, up in the foothills, down in high water tables. So it's really important to know that the builder understands how to build here in Idaho and what are things to look out for. For me, I've been through so many processes with different builders. I know ones that I'd use every time. I know some that I probably wouldn't use and I'd steer you away from just because of my experience and to tell you about it. When we start talking about new construction, they kind of call Idaho the Wild West. There's certain laws and regulations that aren't put in place that California has that we don't do here. Like, for instance, gutters aren't part of city code. So a lot of times some of the production builders put a 10-foot section behind the pad and call that a gutter.
Yes, Boise, Idaho, and the Treasure Valley tend to be drier than most areas. You tend to see a lot flatter roofs here, but that doesn't mean we don't get torrential downpours. Just a few weeks ago, it flooded here. In the north end, the streets were getting flooded. And that same day, a good friend of mine had a water problem where it wasn't properly mitigated around the house. Because of that, it made it in through the back door in the basement and flooded it. And because it was a flood where the water was coming in from the downstairs basement, it was not covered under insurance.
There's so many little details that it's important to have an agent that understands the questions to ask particular builders. You're building a new construction home, so you might as well get everything that you want. Even though you don't always get everything, it's asking the right questions and having the option in front of you to make that decision.
Hey friends, I wanted to hop on real quick. If you're considering a move to Idaho and you want help with that and you want it to be easy and smooth, then be sure to call, text, or email days, nights, or weekends, and we would love to be your guide on that journey. Next, let's talk about expectations. Expectations between you and the real estate agent, expectations between you and the builder, and then ultimately for you so that you can know what you're getting into and when it might be completed.
Depending on the type of build you're going to do, I always want to paint a picture of what we're going to do and what to expect during the process. And when I talk about expectations, I like to build a timeline, right? To say, hey, if we're going to start here and we're going to end here, what is everything in between? And that's my job, is as I educate you through the process, I give you these different scenarios so you're prepared and that you know what's going to happen so there's no surprises.
Next, let's talk about location. Do you want to be in the foothills or do you want to be next to the river? And then after that, we'll talk about location in terms of, do you want to be in a planned community or do you want to start from scratch from an empty lot?
Location, when you're talking about, different areas, we have a lot of variety here. You can be up in the mountains in the pine trees. You can be down in the desert. You can be out more towards our wine country. It's not quite Napa, but it's definitely getting there. I get so many people all the time that talk about water. Everybody wants water. And when I get to that scenario, I'm like, hey, we have some rivers. We have some big lakes. A lot of communities, since we have a high water table here, where we have reservoir ponds, we consider those water lots as well in Idaho. As far as being on the river, it really depends on how far away you want to be from a community. So a lot of times we really need to talk about lifestyle, what's important to you, and then from there we can look at different water lots. When someone says, hey, I want to be right on the river, I'm like, okay, if you want to be on the river, you want to be in Boise, a lot of that stuff's already built out. So you can't be right on the river unless you want an existing home. But if you want, we can go out a little bit further to the Snake River. You can be right on the river. We could probably find some land and go down that scenario. I like to do an overview of a Google map. I'll take people through and I'll say, hey, we have mountains up here with a river. You're going to be an hour away from Boise. We have some reservoirs there. We have some ponds that you can be on, some smaller lakes. Again, there's different varieties, but I think lifestyle is important when you're kind of painting a whole picture before we even get to a water situation.
Now, in terms of location, let's talk about a vacant lot in relation to a planned community.
By building in a planned community, a lot of times you already have sidewalks that are built and roads, other homes and plants. So you can kind of see somewhat what that community is going to look like. It's a little bit more straightforward. There's not as much details needed, right? Because your lot is already laid out. So a lot of times I'll have the builders take that house once it's designed, put it on that lot and kind of show you, hey, I have 5 feet next to myself on each side, or I have a 30-foot backyard, and really try to help visualize what that's going to look like. And then once that's done, then we go into a vacant lot, a lot that doesn't have any infrastructure. In that scenario, a lot more planning goes involved, right? Because a lot of times it might just be a dirt lot with some trees. So we got to do some grading. Sometimes we have to bring in some septic and even a well. That's an additional cost that you're going to have to build in. Where if you build in a planned community, all those things are taken care of for you. You already have a lot picked out and it's just the cost of the home.
Now let's talk about negotiations, things you should be thinking about and things your realtor should be doing.
In a build, as the buyer, you have a lot of ability in the front end to really, talk about your finishes and talk about, how you want your house positioned. And all these different scenarios are going to happen that you need to have up front. Because once you sign that contract, you have to follow that contract. It has timelines, it has obligations financially for you. So really answering questions you might not know, and for me being proactive and asking questions you might not think of is invaluable when you go through the process. I will tell you though, one thing I see a lot, and especially with custom builds, there's always things you're going to want to change in a home. Buying a home is the most stressful thing most people do, and my job is to make that a lot easier. The last thing I want is to have a buyer regret their decision to make that build. Let's talk about negotiations with production builds. A lot of times with production, they might help with closing costs or refrigerator, blinds. Sometimes builders won't put a backyard in the production, so we can negotiate that, and even fencing. Again, if you have an agent, I always say ask 3 times, right? And you probably get the answer that you want. That's a lot of times what I'll do, because if you don't ask, you don't know. Let's talk about negotiation with semi-custom. Give you a scenario. We've been through permits before. They're building the home. They've already got structural done, and then we're making adjustments to selections. What we're trying to do is say, hey, within a certain budget, can we make a selection to get a different wall color? Can we get different, faucets? And again, depending on someone's scenario, that can be a great option because there's less risk, because there's less time from the time we go under contract till the time we close. So let's talk about negotiations when it comes to custom builds. When you do a custom, a lot of times with these custom builders, you get a designer that comes along with you through the process. So when we're negotiating, what I always like to do with custom is a lot of times they're like, hey, here's the house. You can go see a house that's similar. You can look at some of the finishes, do that, but also talk with them about what they're going to provide and what that level is. We need to make sure, especially when we're going through a contract, is that, hey, I'm not going to have my client give you all this earnest money until we set up the expectations of the house itself. What are the specs? What are the materials that you're going to be using? Can we go to your design center ahead of time? A lot of times builders are like, hey, give me $20,000, $40,000 non-refundable. I'm going to build you a house. And when you're doing a custom one, you definitely need to know what you're getting yourself into.
Now let's talk about types of loans that are available to you. And those are largely dependent on what you choose, whether you go with a full custom, whether you go with a semi-custom project, or whether you go with a production home that's already been completed for you. So if we want to start with a full custom project, that would be a construction loan. Anyone that wants to embark on a full custom build project needs to be completely aware of what they are stepping into. I think first and foremost, I'd want folks to understand just not only the financial cost associated with a full custom project, but the emotional cost as well, right? So you are fully responsible to finance the construction all the way through, as well as be the point person for all the decisions, right? If you decide you want to go with a full custom project, you're going to get a construction loan. And even if you're flush with cash, I would highly, highly recommend that you still partner with a lender and get a construction loan. And there are several reasons for that, but mainly would be accountability. What that does is it forces the builder to work through an established process of construction financing, right? And everything would be based upon what the home is assessed or valued at the end, and that's called the as completed appraised value. So if you partner with a lender, that builder is going to be forced to work through that process, right? And the reason being is that lender wants to ensure that that project gets completed, right? The builder could go bankrupt halfway through. The buyer could end up needing to walk away for whatever reason. So having the bank involved, having the lender in place with the construction financing really helps to minimize that risk and force everybody to perform and work towards getting the project completed on the appropriate timeline, as well as within budget. And as the builder completes certain milestones throughout the project, then the lender will work with the builder on his draw requests. So the builder would then have to say the framing is completed. He would submit for a draw request that would get him paid for framing. Without the construction financing in place, again, even if you're flush with cash, you are then the responsible party to determine what the builder has completed or not completed. I think most people come to Idaho with a dream of a large piece of property and a fully custom home, and they're thinking 5+ acres, but the reality is probably most people would be better off in a semi-custom or a production home, and that's what they end up wanting. They don't necessarily understand the stress or the cost, both financially and emotionally, to work through the process of a fully custom home. That is, I think, paramount for you to understand before you would embark on something like that. So do you want to assume the risk of a fully custom project? That's the question you have to ask yourself and the question that you have to answer. So let's assume you don't want to take that risk. And then instead, we're going to look towards financing a semi-custom or a production-built home. That's where we would use a traditional loan. And a traditional loan, we mean something like a conventional mortgage or an FHA or a VA or a USDA, just kind of depending on what you qualify for and what's best for that situation. So if I had a bet, I would say most folks probably don't want to assume the risk of a fully custom project. Instead, they would be better off getting established with a semi-custom or a production home.
I think to sum this up, ultimately, what we want is what's best for you. And sometimes that might be directing you to something else after we kind of share our experiences with you and what that process is going to be like. Hopefully that's what this film is doing for you right now. Whether you choose to do a complete custom home or a semi-custom home or a production home, Either way, we want to make sure that you know exactly what you're walking into so that you don't lose your mind in the process. Again, you don't have to go far to hear horrible stories about people going through the process of building a custom home and then ultimately wishing they wouldn't have done it and would have instead gone for a semi-custom or a production home. Lastly, let's delve into earnest money. What it is, why it's important, and how it's used in the home building process.
Let's talk about earnest money. So earnest money is something by definition that is money you put down in earnest. You earnestly are saying to a seller of a piece of property that I want to buy that, right? And so earnest money is effectively an initial down payment.
Now let's talk about earnest money and if it is refundable.
The first is going to be the inspection of the property. So we would always encourage that you hire a third-party inspector to come basically look behind the scenes of the property. It's like a mechanic would do to a car. Lift up the hood and look at it, inspect everything, check the oil, and try to give you a comprehensive report of what that property looks like. So you've put your earnest money down, you have the inspector come out, you get a report from your inspector, and you learn a whole bunch of things about the property that you're very unhappy with, such that you want to walk away. Well, the good news is your earnest money is refundable to you based upon that inspection contingency. But let's say the report from the inspector looks great and you want to proceed. Great. Awesome. Moving on to the next thing. The next thing that your earnest money would be refundable or contingent on would be the appraised value of the property. So let's say you go under contract on a house to buy it for $500,000. Let's say that the appraisal comes back and the home is only valued at $470,000. So that's a $30,000 gap from where you said you thought the market was, where the seller thought the market was, but where the third-party appraiser thinks that the value of the house is. So that gives you an opportunity to either renegotiate with the seller of the property or completely walk away, right? Nobody should ever be in a situation where they're forced to buy a house that's underwater, right? And that's exactly true from a financing standpoint. No lender wants a buyer to ever, or borrower to ever be underwater, as they would potentially have incentive to walk away. So a third way that earnest money could be refundable would be through a financing contingency. So let's say that you make an offer to purchase a home, you've had it inspected, the results of the inspection were great. You've had it appraised as part of your loan and the appraisal came back sufficient, we're moving forward. The last way that your earnest money could be refundable to you is through something called a financing contingency. And that's basically saying that your financing fell through, right? So your loan has been submitted to an underwriter, the underwriter has reviewed your loan and your documents, your income, your assets, all those things, and they've come back with a decline, which is super unfortunate, and you never want to be in that situation. But in the event that that was to happen, your earnest money would also be refundable to you. Now let's talk about earnest money in relation to the three different types of projects we talked about. So earnest money is very similar and is part of any offer you would make to purchase a semi-custom or a production home. So that can be typically right around 1% of the purchase price, plus or minus whatever you and your realtor believe is needed to get your offer accepted. Earnest money as related to a fully custom project is less common. So a lender typically is not going to require that you put earnest money down when you get a construction loan. However, the lender is going to require that you make a substantial down payment when you start a construction loan. Typically, that's going to be about a 20% minimum down payment. And that puts your skin in the game as the buyer and the borrower of this construction project.
Let's talk about a non-refundable deposit. In some cases, especially with new construction, earnest money can be non-refundable. This is because the builder is taking on significant risk by customizing the home for you. And if you back out of the deal, they might have a really hard time trying to sell that home that was customized for you to somebody else. Which brings up 2 points. It's crucial to understand the contract before you ever sign it and provide earnest money. And the second thing is that it's crucial to have an experienced agent in these kind of deals to save you from any pitfalls and help you understand what you're getting into. So whether you are a first-time home buyer or a seasoned veteran, we really hope that this video was helpful to you. If you're looking for a guide in this process of buying or building a new home here in Idaho, then reach out. We get calls, texts, and emails every day from people just like you in that process, and we love it. Here is my contact info. Feel free to pause the video, make sure to write it down, and reach out to schedule a one-on-one consultation with me to help you in your journey of calling Idaho home.